The big-time boss of New York, he had 10,000 influencer men. He heated them up to the top of the hill. Then he sent them straight back down again. When they were up, they were up. And when they were down, they were down. And when they were only halfway up, they were low-key, neither up nor down, no cap.
Just imagine, you're sitting in another pointless meeting at work. Your boss, let's call him Dave, has just announced the company's newest strategic initiative. It's the fourth one this year. Last quarter, everyone was all about synergistic optimization. Before that, it was customer-centric innovation. And before that, hell, nobody even remembers anymore because Dave marched everyone up that hill and then immediately marched them back down when the numbers didn't look pretty enough for the quarterly report. Sound familiar? Congratulations, you've been living in a nursery rhyme. I was in exactly this situation a few years back, watching my coworkers' faces as Dave explained why we were pivoting away from the thing we'd spent 6 months building. That's when this little ditty started playing in my head, and I nearly snorted coffee out my nose. Because holy shit, we were the 10,000 men, and Dave was the grand old duke of absolutely nowhere. But here's what really got me. We kept following him. Up the hill, down the hill, halfway up again, like some kind of corporate conga line of confusion. And that, my friends, is where the shadow work gold lives. Before we dive into the psychological meat of this thing, let me tell you about the actual duke this rhyme is supposedly about. Because once you know the backstory, you'll never look at incompetent leadership the same way again. Meet Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, second son of King George III. This guy was basically the poster child for nepotism gone wrong. Picture someone who got promoted to general not because he was good at military strategy, but because his daddy owned the army. Yeah, that kind of situation. In 1799, Frederick decided he was going to show those French revolutionaries what British military might look like. So he gathered up about 30,000 troops, though the song rounds it down to a nice, neat 10,000, artistic license, I guess, and marched them off to Holland to fight the French and their Dutch allies. The plan was simple. Land in Holland, march inland, kick some ass, restore the Dutch monarchy, come home to ticker-tape parades and probably a few new medals to pin on his increasingly decorated chest. What actually happened was, well, imagine if military strategy was a video game and Frederick kept hitting the wrong buttons. He'd advance his troops, then retreat, then advance again, then retreat again. His soldiers spent more time marching back and forth than they did actually fighting. The Dutch and French must have been watching this like, Are they okay over there? Should we call someone? After months of this military hokey-pokey, Frederick finally admitted defeat and sailed his confused, exhausted army back home. The whole thing was such a clusterfuck that it became a cautionary tale about what happens when you put someone in charge just because they've got the right last name. But here's the kicker. Instead of being court-martialed or exiled or forced to take up knitting, Frederick got to keep his job. He stayed commander-in-chief of the British Army for years afterward. Because apparently, when you're royal, even spectacular failure is just a learning experience. And somehow this tale of military incompetence got turned into a children's song. Because nothing says fun playground activity like reenacting organizational dysfunction. Now, if you've ever worked for someone like our Duke Frederick, and let's be honest, who hasn't? You know exactly what this song is really about. It's about those leaders who confuse motion with progress, who mistake being busy for being effective, who will march you up every hill in sight just to prove they can. But here's where the shadow work gets interesting. It's not just about them, it's about us too. Because for every Duke marching people around in circles, there are 10,000 followers willing to march. Why do we do it? Why do we keep following leaders who clearly don't know where the hell they're going? Let's start with the shadow. Most of us really don't want to look at our addiction to following. Because as much as we love to complain about bad leaders, there's something seductive about being one of the 10,000 men. Someone else makes the decisions, someone else takes the responsibility, and if everything goes to shit, well, you were just following orders, right? I see this shadow everywhere. In the coworker who never speaks up in meetings even when they know the plan is doomed. in the friend who stays in a toxic relationship because it's easier than figuring out what they actually want, in the part of ourselves that would rather be miserable and certain than happy and responsible for our own choices. There's a weird comfort in being led, even when you're being led nowhere. At least you know your place in the formation. At least someone else is supposed to have the map. At least if you just keep marching, someone else will figure out where you're supposed to end up. But here's what your shadow knows and your conscious mind doesn't want to admit. Sometimes following is just cowardice dressed up as loyalty. Sometimes being a team player is just an excuse to avoid the terrifying responsibility of thinking for yourself. Now, let's talk about the shadow on the other side of this equation. Because if you've ever been in charge of anything, a project, a team, a PTA committee, hell, even just picking a restaurant for dinner with friends, you know the terror of being the one who's supposed to know what they're doing. This is the shadow of the failing leader, and it's brutal. It's the part of you that knows deep down that you have no idea what you're doing, but you can't admit it because then everyone would see that the emperor has no clothes. So you keep making decisions, keep giving directions, keep marching people up hills and down again, because at least that looks like leadership. I've seen this shadow wreak havoc in workplaces, families, and communities. The boss who keeps changing direction because they're too proud to admit their first idea wasn't working. The parent who doubles down on strict rules even when they're clearly not helping their kid. The friend who always insists on making the plans, but never actually has good ideas. The really insidious part is that this kind of leadership actually creates more followers. When someone acts confident enough, when they make decisions quickly enough, when they keep the group moving even if it's in circles, people will follow them. Because most folks would rather have a confident leader going nowhere than no leader at all. But there's an even deeper shadow lurking in this rhyme, and it's the one that keeps me up at night. The shadow of meaningless action. Of being so busy doing stuff that you forget to ask whether the stuff you're doing actually matters. Think about those 10,000 men. They're marching with purpose. They're following orders. They're part of something bigger than themselves. They probably feel pretty good about their discipline, their loyalty, their willingness to serve. And they're accomplishing absolutely nothing. This is the shadow of our entire culture right here. We're all marching up hills and down again, convinced that the marching itself means something. We work jobs that don't contribute to anything meaningful. We buy things we don't need to impress people we don't like. We stay busy, stay productive, stay moving, because God forbid we stop long enough to ask where the hell we're actually going. I think about this every time I see someone bragging about their grind, their 80-hour work weeks, their packed schedules. Because sometimes grinding is just another word for marching in circles. Sometimes being busy is just a way to avoid asking the hard questions about whether your life is actually going anywhere you want to be. And then there's that last verse, the one that really gets under your skin if you let it. And when they were only halfway up, they were neither up nor down. This is the shadow of limbo, of being stuck in the in-between spaces where nothing is resolved and everything is possible, and that's somehow worse than just being definitively fucked. We all know this place. It's the job you're thinking about leaving but haven't quite worked up the courage to quit. It's the relationship that's not quite working but not quite broken enough to end. It's the dream you're not quite brave enough to chase but not quite ready to give up on. It's that maddening space where you're not quite anywhere, where you can't claim the victory of reaching the top or the relief of accepting the bottom. You're just suspended, waiting, neither up nor down. And sometimes that waiting becomes its own kind of prison. Because at least when you're moving, even if you're moving in circles, you feel like something's happening. But when you're halfway up the hill just standing there, you have to confront the fact that maybe you don't actually know where you want to go. Here's what I've learned after years of doing this work. Sometimes the marching itself is what transforms you. Sometimes you need to go up the hill and back down again, not because there's treasure at the top, but because the journey teaches you something you couldn't learn any other way. Maybe those 10,000 men needed to learn about loyalty and persistence and working together under difficult circumstances. Maybe they needed to discover their own strength, their own capacity to keep going when things didn't make sense. Maybe they needed to find out who they were, when everything went sideways. Maybe the Duke needed to learn that being in charge doesn't mean having all the answers, that leadership sometimes means admitting you're lost and asking for directions. I'm not saying all pointless marching is secretly meaningful. Some of it really is just waste and confusion and leaders who don't know what they're doing. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the thing that looks like failure is actually the exact experience you needed to become who you're meant to be. The trick is learning to tell the difference, learning when to keep marching and when to stop and ask, wait, where the hell are we going? Learning when to follow and when to lead and when to just sit down on the side of the hill and figure out what you actually want. So the next time you hear this little ditty, don't just think about some historical duke and his military mishaps. Think about your own relationship with leadership and following, with purpose and pointless activity, with being up and being down and being stuck somewhere in the middle. And maybe ask yourself, if you've got 10,000 moments of energy and attention to spend today, where do you want to march them? What hill is actually worth climbing? What direction would you choose if you weren't just following the person in front of you? Because here's the thing about being human. We're all going to march up some hills and down again. We're all going to follow some leaders who don't know where they're going, and we're all going to lead people ourselves sometimes without having a clue about the destination. The question isn't whether you'll ever find yourself marching in circles. The question is whether you'll notice when it's happening, and whether you'll have the courage to stop and ask if there's somewhere else you'd rather be. And please don't forget to like and subscribe if you think what you've heard is important and useful.